Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be meeting with you over Zoom today. This is kind of my first one that I am hosting. I've been a part of a couple of these Zoom webinars around the country, and so thought it's my turn to host one. I'm a pretty social person, and I typically like doing the whole in-person meeting. But nonetheless, with COVID the way that it is, I've become quite proficient at the Zoom meeting, and we do the whole House of Commons now on Zoom, which cuts down on the travel significantly. But it is still very weird talking to a computer screen, even though there's people participating. I am just sitting here in my office talking to a screen. And if somebody from 45 years ago was to show up and just walk by the end of my office, they would think I'm absolutely crazy. But here we are nonetheless. So welcome. Today we have my colleague, Tom Kmiec. Tom represents a riding in Calgary called Calgary Shepherd. I think it was a brand new riding the same time that Peace River Westlock was a brand new riding. And so we're both first-time members of Parliament for brand new ridings. And so we both got elected together in 2015. I didn't know him before I got elected, and he didn't know me before we got elected, but we hit it off very well. Similar stage of life. Tom has 3 children.
Yeah, 3 kids.
3 kids, and I've got 4, and they're about the same ages. So our kids play together, and we have a lot in common, I guess you could say. And so we've built a friendship over the last 5 years. And so I said, and Tom's interested and got into the politics for kind of the same reasons as I did. And one of those things is, people always ask me, Arnold, why did you get involved? And I said, well, I just got frustrated with the rest of the country always pooping on Alberta, and I wanted to do something about that. And lo and behold, eventually my name was on the ballot. And one of the big things for all of Albertans is the whole idea of equalization, and we all talk about how much money we send to the rest of the country and how little money we get back. But that is something that we all talk about a lot, but don't necessarily understand in detail what that all entails. I know I've attempted several times to get a good grasp on that, and there's a lot of money that is transferred back and forth between the federal government and the provincial government, and from individuals in each province, and all of that. So Tom Kmiec has set out to clarify a whole bunch of that stuff. And he actually has a private member's bill that he has proposed in the House of Commons. So, Tom, welcome to the Promised Land, as I like to call it, Northern Alberta, Peace River Westlock. We've got a whole bunch of folks from my riding on tonight. I think I know most of them. Other than Blue Bill 55, I'm not sure who that is, but I'm sure him or her will let us know who that is later on. But either way, I would invite you to tell us a little bit about yourself, because I didn't do a lot of that, and then introduce your bill and what your motivations are for that, and where you hope to go with it.
Yeah, thanks, Arnold. So this is the first time I'm doing this virtually with you, but I have been up to what you call the Promised Land, especially at least Nerlandia and a little bit north of there too, where you lose cell phone service, but you can go off-road. So thanks everybody for joining. I know this is a Friday. There's probably lots of different things you'd prefer to do on a Friday night to talk about equalization. I was elected at the same time as Arnold was back in 2015. And honestly, if it was up to me, I would be doing a private member's bill on the disability tax credit or on rare diseases or access to drugs, something like that. That's kind of my area of interest and why I ran for public office. Arnold told you I have 3 living kids. I had 4 kids. One of them passed away in the last term from a rare disease. But in the last parliament, when I was door knocking in the last election, I had almost every street, I had somebody bring up the fact that they were fed up with our treatment in Confederation, and that they we're really seriously looking at separation, and it was all ranges, like, young people, old people, people who had been in Alberta for 20 years, people who had been in Alberta for 50, people who had been coming from a family which were homesteaders who had been here for 5 generations. So like a lot of people. And so I decided in 2019 when I was reelected, you know what, I'm going to do a bill on equalization. So I thought about it for a long time. I talked to quite a bit of so-called experts in the area. What could you do as a member of parliament who's a backbencher in the opposition, and that's where I am? What can you actually do? So in private member's bill, you're not allowed to spend money. You cannot spend government money. You don't have that right. You have to get what's called a royal proclamation from the Minister of Finance, and I can tell you they don't give those out. It's very rare. So my private member's bill is C-263, which is the Equalization and Transfers Fairness Act, is the name I'm giving it. But the long name is an act to amend the Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act. So the Federal Fiscal Arrangements Act. It's a very long, convoluted name, and that's actually the law that governs equalization. So there's a few things. I make the differentiation between big E equalization and small E equalization. Big E equalization is in the Constitution. That's why we're going to have a referendum, I think on October 18th, if I remember correctly, of this year. That's big E equalization. That referendum, I haven't seen the question yet from the provincial government, but it would be to remove it from the Constitution. So to give a negotiating hand to our premier to go to Ottawa and say, hey, I would like to remove this. And I've got the mandate from the people to ask for its removal. Let's make a deal, basically. That's big E equalization. Small E equalization is everything else having to do with it. So small E is the actual transfers of cash between the provinces. And the Alberta government doesn't cut a check called equalization to the federal government. It doesn't go from Edmonton to Ottawa. It's everything. So I'll give you an idea of what it actually includes. It includes, I'm going to read them off: personal income taxes, equalization and stabilization, corporate income taxes, CPP net contributions, non-defense purchases, old age security benefits, employment insurance payments, less receipts, GST and excise tax, defense purchases, and other policies. And I get these from Professor Robert Mansell, who's done a lot of work. So this is what my bill is going to do. This is what is doable, and it's a starting point. I'm not saying this will fix all of our problems. I'm always telling people this is a starting point, I think, for bigger and better things to get some fairness in the system the way it works right now. So one is I would get rid of the cap on stabilization refund payments, the rebates so-called. The premier has talked about it already. All the premiers across all of Canada agree on this point, that the per capita cap that exists right now at $60, the Liberals are amending it to be $170 per person. The cap is unfair. It should not be capped. It was introduced in 87, 86. There's no reason for it. There's no explanation for what it exists. You should remove the cap. That would give us about a $3 billion rebate on every single year, and that it would fluctuate year to year. But since our royalty went down so quickly, our rebate would obviously be higher. It's $3 billion that I calculated. And that's a specific ask of the Alberta government. And again, it's supported by the Council of the Federation. All premiers agreed to this in a communique from November 2019. I have it in hand. It's a public document. The second thing I would do is I would make both the calculations and the results of the calculations of equalization public. So right now, people like Professor Mansell have to go and comb through all of these documents and make a best guess on what the equalization amounts are actually totaling up to. So it's basically, it's a gross number. Sometimes it's netted between what is taken out of Alberta, goes to Ottawa, and then what Ottawa provides in services. You know, that it's a difficult calculation to make. So tonight I'll be using numbers from Professor Mansell in a book called Moment of Truth, which is edited by three individuals. I mean, I think we're all familiar with Jack Mintz, Ted Morton, and Tom Flanagan. Full disclosure, Ted Morton used to be my boss many, many years ago at the Alberta Finance Department. I was his policy advisor at the time, so I did work partially on things like equalization and transfers at the time. Actually, I have been to federal, provincial, territorial meetings of the finance ministers, so we can talk about that too a little bit. So that's another thing I would do. All the calculations, all the results should be made public, because then there will be no disagreement. The federal government has all this information. It just chooses to release them by drips and drabs. I would like them all in one place. The next thing my private members bill would do is force all of the consultation documents with the provinces to be released to the public. Every letter, every meeting, all of it should be available to, we pay for this anyways, and because it has such a huge impact on us Albertans, we should know about it. It would also be a trigger, frankly, for us politicians in Ottawa to pay attention to it in every single budget document when it's coming up and being renegotiated. It happened in 2017 that the government kind of snuck it in an omnibus budget bill that was over 800 pages. I have sat on the Finance Committee of Parliament. I can tell you, after page 200, your eyes begin to glaze over. May of every single year is typically when the Finance Committee meets every single day for 10-hour marathons of meetings, endless meetings with stakeholders and officials, and you get into the minutia of things. I mean, I love the minutia, but not over 800 pages worth. It's easy to miss things, especially when they're not labeled properly. So speaking of the labeling, at the beginning, I told you it's an act to amend the Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act. I want to change that to the Equalization and Transfer Act. Laws should be named after what they are and what they do. By putting equalization into it, us politicians federally and provincially too could do a control fine on the electronic document, type in equalization like I always do. There's three things I do whenever I get a budget bill. I search for pipelines with an S and without an S. I search for energy, oil, natural gas, equalization. And I look at those things first in a document before I move on to other things. Call the law what it actually is. So Equalization and Transfers Act, that's an amendment to that particular one. And the last thing, by the way, all of these ones I've mentioned so far, that's supported by all the premiers in the Council of the Federation communique. This is not controversial in any way. The last thing to do is a little bit more controversial, I would think, but not, I think, in Alberta. My private member's bill would require the federal government to negotiate in good faith after a provincial referendum on equalization. And my purpose is basically to bind the hands of the federal government, because I could see a situation where we could say vote a majority, let's say 80 to 20 in percentages with a solid voter turnout, and the federal government could just ignore it. Even in the Clarity Act decision, the reference opinion given to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court ruled that a government would have to negotiate, but there's nothing forcing a Liberal government or any federal government to negotiate with the province. That becomes a political question. So what I would do in my private member's bill is require good faith negotiations. And if the minister refuses to negotiate, then they have to explain in a document to Parliament why they refuse to negotiate. And because that's a very embarrassing thing to do, to explain why you didn't meet, the popular mandate given to a premier, they wouldn't do that. And if they do negotiate, I also want them to explain why they entered into negotiations. This would be like a dry legal document, but it would create lots of work and lots of documentation that then us parliamentarians could get access to. So that's my purpose in doing it. That would bind the hands of the federal government. In doing so, it's pretty comprehensive in its requirements, and I just don't think a federal government could ignore it. Between the legal opinion, so the legal opinion from the Supreme Court of Canada on the Clarity Act, and then this law that hopefully would be in place, the federal government would be compelled to negotiate. And that we would get a little bit more fairness. We were starting to get to the fairness of the system. And I think when we're trying to change equalization for the better or abolish it, we have to know what we're talking about. And what we're talking about is a whole bunch of different things from a whole bunch of different programs. So while we could abolish it, remove it out of the Constitution, it's still going to exist in one sense, because CPP contributions netted out are not equal across the country. We happen to have less seniors in Alberta collecting CPP than you do in, say, New Brunswick or Nova Scotia or PEI. So there'll always be an imbalance there. So we should get to a common agreement of what are we talking about? What is the difference? And I think this bill gets us to that point. I mean, again, it took me a year to get to this point. I removed a few parts of it and put some different elements into it to try and get to that point. And I consulted widely in Eastern Canada too with different organizations, and with actually the Quebec Trade Office. They have one in Ottawa as well. And I think this is a compromise bill. Like it doesn't do everything I think I would like it to do. I would like to spend money, obviously. I would like to net out the difference so that Albertans are actually netted out fair. But because I can't, I think this is a kind of good compromise series of ideas that would get to that fairness. We would have all the numbers. We'd have all the consultation documents. The law would actually be called what it is. And then we would have a guarantee that in a referendum, they would have to negotiate. So it's like the basics of like a democratic system where full transparency, full fairness, we're all talking about the same thing. So that's what my private member's bill is going to do if I can pass it through Parliament.
Wow, thanks, Tom. That's a lot of stuff. You mentioned the word fairness often, and that's something that comes up often. But whenever I'm discussing it, what is fair at the end of the day is always what the debate is all about. So I guess in your terms, what would you think would be fair? Because you can, even when it comes to, like, we're not talking about that tonight, but even like the vote count, for example, folks are like, well, there's more votes out east, but there are more votes, right? And that's that to come up with something that's fair. It's always a little bit. That's the crux of the issue. So what do you, when you're talking about fairness, where do you, if you say that would be fair, what would that be?
So like it's an issue of like equity versus what's equitable, right? Like we're not trying to have the same end outcome for everybody, because that just can't happen. Alberta can't be treated the same way PEI is treated. We can't be treated the same way Saskatchewan is treated. Every province has to be treated according to its needs in this system. I think it would be fair, I think all of us would agree, I think a lot of Easterners would agree as well, is what's fair is when we suffer a 90% decline in our royalty revenue, that Canada is waiting there with a helping hand to hold us up while we make it through the downturn in commodity prices like we had after the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Russian Federation, right at the beginning of this pandemic, had a price war that forced WTI at least to decline to almost minus $40 a barrel by the time the contracts flipped over. So I would, like, to me, fairness is the federal government is there to support the provinces when they have a huge decline in revenues. And I think that's perfect. It's a perfectly equitable expectation for us to have, is when a revenue declines substantially very quickly, that there not be a random cap put into place in how much the federal government could refund directly to the Alberta government to sustain it. Likewise, in such a huge decline, we should honestly expect the federal government to intervene in such an emergency and do large-scale infrastructure spending immediately to keep people working. That would also be, and that would again go towards those equalization net totals. That would be fairness. Instead, they sent, I think, $200 to $250 million, which was kind of like an EI difference rebate. Calgary didn't qualify, but Edmonton did. Like there was a bunch of randomness in the system, and that's what's unfair, is when you treat Canadians differently, but depending on what part of the country they're in. And it's perfectly reasonable for us. At least that's the argument I keep making with Bloc MPs, NDP MPs, and Liberal MPs, is we don't want a handout. We just want a hand up. So come alongside us to support our province during the royalty declines so that we can actually rebuild ourselves. And it's already happening. I just looked at the provincial government budget, and I know there's a new one coming down, but about 90% of the revenue has bounced back. So we're getting there on our own, which we're always pretty good at doing. But fairness, I think, demands that the federal government step in and offer a full rebate and then offer infrastructure projects to offset the huge decline in employment.
So if I understood you correctly, there is nothing in the federal budget that is called equalization.
That's right. Yeah. So what it'll be called, so I'm getting some papers out. It's called a federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act. So there's no line item called equalization. In the fall economic statement, which actually we'll be debating again on Tuesday, the government is making amendments to the per capita cap to take it from $60 per person to $170 per person. Again, this is the last per capita program that exists that has this unevenness across the country, because for example, the Canada Health Transfer is equal across all provinces for all Canadians. That was actually the last province to be treated fairly on health transfers was Alberta, and that was a combination of Ed Stelmach and Ted Morton, who harassed Prime Minister Harper at the time endlessly until he agreed basically to match it equally across the entire country. But this stabilization fund, we are the ones who are going to be beneficiaries this time around, rightfully so, and we're the last place to be treated fairly.
So in the Constitution, there is a term called equalization, but that's rarely referenced in the budget, is what you're telling us. That's
right. That doesn't appear at all. Just like most sections of the Constitution are never referenced in a budget document. That's exactly. That's big equalization is in the Constitution. Small equalization is actually a transfer of cash between provinces.
Okay, and what's the definition of big E? Like, what does it say in the Constitution there?
I don't have the section with me here, but if you want, I can look it up for you and just read it out. But it's pretty dry. It doesn't have an amount in it, and it doesn't have the formula in it, which is why it's kind of everything to everyone. It can mean whatever you want it to mean if you're the federal government, which is basically what they've done. Because the federal government, the negotiations it does with the provincial governments, it's not a negotiation. It's the federal government controls it entirely. It decides what these transfers can be, and it can change them at will with no consultation if it chooses not to have a consultation.
Okay. One of the issues with private members' bills, or any bill, I guess, at this point, is that election will wipe it right out. And from all the rumors that are running around Ottawa right now, we are likely to be in an election sooner or later. What's the likelihood of us debating this in Ottawa, your bill?
So if it wasn't for the pandemic, frankly, and having eliminated, because every day, right, we have an hour of private members' business, it allows you to cycle through a lot of these bills. If it wasn't for the pandemic, we would have debated it and voted on it within this parliament. Now we run the risk, because there's going to be likely a federal election, perhaps in the spring, maybe in the fall. The chances are growing dimmer. Every day that we lose of Parliament sitting is another strike against my bill being negotiated. But I am also negotiating because we are allowed to trade down 30, and I'm starting now the process of figuring out whom can I negotiate with to exchange my number. So for those who don't know, every member of parliament enters a lottery when you're elected and swear your oath of office. And this lottery is for all members of parliament minus members of the cabinet and parliamentary secretaries, which is technically a member of parliament could spend their entire career never having even have an hour of debate or a vote on their private members bill. I drew, I think it was 136. Again, the number changes a little bit as people are nominated for the cabinet or drop. And so I'm working on right now trying to get down into that order of precedence so that we can actually debate my bill.
Okay, very cool. We've got a bunch of time here, and I've got quite a few people on the line here. I'm hoping that folks can raise their hand. I think most folks have a raise hand function. Joe, I see you're still out in the attendees part of it. Do you have a raise hand? You can just throw that in the chat there. But other than that, everybody else that's that I can see here, if you've got a question you'd like to ask to either Tom or I, please just raise your hand and I'll recognize you, and then we can go forward from there. So, all right, Dale, Joe says he doesn't have a raise hand function there, so we'll probably have to get everyone who's still on the attendee side in so that they can raise their hand. So are there any questions for either Tom or myself on this topic or any other? So Blue Bill 55.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Not too bad. My name is Bill Cunningham. You were asking earlier, you didn't know who I was. Well, now you know. I used to work with Donna Buczynski, actually. Indirectly many years ago. Having said that, so this whole equalization, well, I'm going to call it what I think it is, the equalization program. So was this not started by his father, Trudeau's father, in 1982. And having said that, and with all that went on with Alberta and the Liberal government in those years, is this kind of, what skin in the game have you got by trying to achieve this goal you're trying to achieve? What skin in the game? Do you seriously believe, I don't mean to belittle what you're thinking, do you seriously believe that you actually have a chance at having this law changed?
Okay, so how about I take thanks,
Yeah,
Bill,
sure,
for the
Tom.
question. So equalization actually
I'm
predates.
sorry, it was for Tom.
Yeah, that's okay. It's a good question.
Sorry.
So it's two parts to me. So let me answer the first part. It started before 1982. It started, the oldest number I have is 1961. It's been around for a very long time. And I'll quote some numbers too of when equalization and transfers became huge and then it kind of shrank, because it does change every decade. There's definitely a trend. As one part of the country gets really wealthy compared to another one, there's this elasticity to it. So the transfers become really enormous, and then as things equalize again, it begins to shrink down. So I have numbers going back to at least 1961. The last time Alberta took it was in 1965. It almost qualified for it in 1988, and then the last time was 1988 basically is the last time we almost qualified for it. So I mean, not quite when Trudeau Sr. was in power. It would have been Mulroney. And then just some numbers here again. The last time the transfers were enormous, and I mean huge, between the regions of Canada was between 1980 and 1989. And the differences between the provinces totaled up to $321 billion that in variation of wealth between the provinces. And then 2000, 2009 was $306 billion. And I expect over the next decade or so, once we look back, we'll have another huge difference between the regions in terms of wealth. So it does predate Trudeau the first versus Trudeau the second. All bad things come in threes, so I expect Trudeau the third to terrorize us in 20 years or so, and my kids.
No doubt.
And then in terms of like skin in the game, so skin in the game, I guess my personal credibility that I could actually get this done. I actually think we have more consensus now than we used to, because we have this Council of the Federation communique where they basically agreed to get rid of the cap on the federal stabilization refund or rebate. And they agreed, more transparency and many more things to happen. A lot of provincial premiers are either center-right or they're progressive conservatives or they're conservatives of some sort, including Premier Legault of Quebec. So I think there's a lot of agreement there. And I think for the first time in a long time, Alberta just cannot contribute as much to the rest of the Confederation as it did before. And the people who will suffer the most from this will be Ontarians, because they're going to be asked to shoulder what they have historically shouldered, which is the difference. And it's going to be up to them to figure it out, not up to us, because the transfers will begin to diminish. The biggest transfer out of the province of Alberta is personal income taxes, which works out to $2,069 per person, not per taxpayer, between 2009 and 2018. Again, I'm using Robert Mansell's numbers. So my skin in the game is, my personal credibility that I think I can get this done. I'm confident I can convince Bloc MPs that this is a decent idea. I'm less confident of NDP MPs, just because I think that referendum component, they may think of it as grandstanding. And frankly, in a national majority conservative government, we would do so much more. Like, I have a bunch of ideas in the back of my head I would love to see done, including things like in the calculation, including all Crown Corporation revenue. And that's the second thing I'd love to see us seriously consider is the cost of delivering public services as use an average and then decline from it. So there's a lot more that we could do. I think this is the starting point, the building blocks of something better. And in a majority conservative government, I'd go back to whoever's the finance minister and say, I had the building blocks, but we could do so much more. And that's the way I see private members' bills that don't pass. it's in the future they become government legislation. And the example I'm going to give is our colleague Kevin Waugh on sports betting, single issue sports betting, had tabled a private member's bill on it, and the government stole his bill and tried to table their own legislation, stealing the entire content of the idea. So it does happen. It happens more often than people give it credit for. And I'm happy if the federal government steals the contents of my bill and passes it as government legislation. I will not be offended if they do.
All right. Bill, you got any other questions? Your mic's still open.
Question.
Here.
Well,
no. All right. Any other question? Oh, Sandra. I got Sandra's with their hand up here. Sandra, if you want to unmute your mic.
There we go. Good evening, everybody. I guess I have when you're talking about the $60 that it was back in what 1987, now they want to change it to 170. That's they pay us per capita or we pay them. Like, I don't know a lot about equalization payments, but it almost sounds like an intermunicipal arrangement, be it different. You do this and we do this, and how much is federally paid for and how much is provincially paid for. Is that correct? A bit of a simplified version of it. But I guess I would really like to know how those figures, is there a percentage each province pays? How did they come up with those figures?
So I can answer that. Thank you for the question. So the $60 per capita cap that exists right now till the fall economic statement, if it passes, that's only on the Fiscal Stabilization Fund. So that's the amount that's repaid to a province when it suffers a huge royalty decline. It's called the rebate. That's capped at 60 per capita per person in the province. They're trying to raise it to 170. I'm trying to remove it entirely because there should be no cap. You should give the province the full refund every single time that they have massive drops in revenue. The details of how it works, frankly, I'm even foggy. I'm trying to get the full numbers, but Alberta Finance verified my numbers and they said, yeah, just get rid of the whole thing. We would like to see the full refund. And then back to the different parts of equalization. So equalization is not just like one check transfer from Alberta to Ottawa, like I mentioned. It's a whole bunch of different programs that are accumulated. They include personal income taxes, defense purchases, CPP, netted out, the difference between what we pay into CPP and what seniors or people 55 plus who've elected to take CPP are collecting. It includes employment insurance payments, net receipts, which should be negative in Alberta for the next cycle go around. It includes, I'm just looking at my list here, like I said, old age security benefits. It includes corporate income taxes, personal income taxes. So the two biggest ones are personal income taxes and corporate income taxes, because our median incomes going into the pandemic and into this latest commodity downturn started last year, it's already ended. Our median incomes were so much higher than the rest of Canada. That has drastically shrank. And equalization, the rebates, the program itself, the way the federal government works with it is on a 3-year rolling average. And they basically, in 2017, renewed the same Harper formula that was there since 2014. The problem with doing something like that is things change. The conditions on the ground change. The whole point of the program was to, and programs really you should call it, is to change it as the economic situation is different on the ground, especially in a situation where your biggest net contributor, Alberta has net contributed over $600 billion since 1965. And that includes everything, right? Net contributed more. You should change the formula, but also you should make the formula public so we all know what we're talking about. Because even the numbers I'm using is Professor Robert Mansell's best guess based on an accumulation of all the numbers. And he has an appendix in Moment of Truth, this collaboration of different subject matters, including equalization and transfer. So it's a complicated subject because there's disagreement between different think tanks and researchers on what is included in equalization and transfers and how the formulas work, because the formulas aren't all made public. And I know that if you go to some of these Quebec think tanks, they disagree on the numbers with Alberta-based researchers. That's why I want the federal government to make it all public and disclose to us exactly what you're using in it, because I know that it's more than just a straight one number. So municipal politics probably makes way more sense than any of this, and I don't blame you. The problem here is the numbers are so huge and so big, and there's such a huge discrepancy between the different regions of the country that it's time to extract from the government both the formula and the results, so we all know what we're talking about and where the different monies are coming from.
Thank you.
All right. Do we have anyone else that wants to ask a question on this topic or any other topic? I'll ask one for you, Tom.
Sure.
The one thing you mentioned is the defense spending. That's something I'd never really even considered as part of the equalization. How does that factor into the equation?
Yeah.
I know there's many like Suffield and
Cold Lake.
like Cold Lake and
Yep.
the Edmonton base and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of that. Is that mostly like returning funds to Alberta?
So, I mean, it's not returning funds into like the Alberta government bucket, but what it is, it's the difference of those bases. So Cold Lake is a giant air base. It's also a huge air target range that's being used by the federal government. So those salaries that they pay, the equipment that is kept there, the maintenance costs, and all the procurement that happens to a base, the food, the water, the electricity, the provision of basic goods, you need parts for doors and repairs for basic materials. All of that is included as an offset in that general netted out of transfers into the province, because you have Suffield, you have Wainwright, you have the bases and the properties kept by the Defense Department, like the Canada Lands Corporation and the Defense Department are the biggest landholders in Canada. Like that's on behalf of the government of Canada, they are the biggest landholders. And so they also pay property taxes to municipalities in some cases, at least for the chattel, if not directly for the land. And there's a bunch of things that they do that is netted out in the difference. And again, those are all things taken into account. So, but procurement is not. Like if we're talking about like, say, LAV vehicles that are being maneuvered from, say, CFB Petawawa, they're being brought to Wainwright for, say, a military training exercise. That doesn't count because that equipment doesn't stay here. If it was manufactured here and it was a direct purchase from, say, a company in Edmonton or in Calgary, that would be counted in those defense purchase numbers. So there's a lot of procurement that the government of Canada does. Frankly, it's billions of dollars every single year. I just did an OSME session with the Office of Small Medium Enterprise. People would be floored about how much procurement the federal government actually does. Everything from purchasing paint to purchasing wood, food, everything. It's all those purchases being done in the province are an offset, including also the salaries we pay. So there are federal public servants, for example, that used to be working in some of the rural parts. Yeah, Vegreville is a perfect example. They were moved to Edmonton. Their salaries are also counted as an offset. There's a CRA office here in Calgary. Those salaries are also counted as an offset in those calculations. Other provinces have the same thing. So there's a whole bunch of these CRA processing offices all across Eastern Canada. Those all count as an offset in it too. Which also brings me to one point I should mention and highlight. So we often talk about what's happening in Ontario and Quebec and how Quebec benefits greatly from equalization and transfers. It's also because when you look at the numbers, they have so many government offices in Gatineau, and on the Ontario side, it's in Ottawa. All of those salaries are offset in those calculations. It's a benefit to them that those places actually exist and are located in those provinces. So that also is netted out in these big transfers.
Okay. Yeah, that's one of the questions on Facebook. There was someone was curious why Quebec gets almost half of the equalization payments.
So it's happened especially over time. So I have the numbers too, kind of over time of what's happened in different decades. And in Quebec, hasn't always benefited from equalization. So back in 1961 to 1969, so we're talking a pretty long time ago, Quebec actually paid into equalization. It netted out to other provinces. And the last time it came incredibly close to paying into Confederation again was between 2000 and 2009. So a big reason for that too, because Quebec's provincial taxes are way, way higher than Alberta's provincial taxes. And I mean orders of magnitude 2 times minimum higher than what you would be paying here. In one of the higher income brackets, I had somebody tell me they're paying 53 to 54% of their income in taxes to their provincial government. Because they're doing that, their actually federal income tax take is much, much smaller, and their incomes are a lot smaller. Like the truth in taxation is the more you tax something, the less of it you will have. That's the truth. You levy a huge property tax and the asset value will fall down. Levy a massive income tax, incomes will fall and people will be compensated in different ways. You might get a better parking spot, a company vehicle, whatever else it is. In the case of Quebec, that is why. It's because they actually understand the formula really well and they've been able to maximize their benefit. It's also what's gone on in Quebec over the last little while is comparatively speaking, they are a province that lower income taxes, it's poorer than other parts of Canada. But again, it's poorer against the average. That average is actually going down because we've suffered through another commodity downturn. So you should see over the next little while, Quebec get less and Alberta pay out less, net out less. And Alberta, the Quebec government, their official policy position in their platform is to get off equalization payments. They want to net in, they want to stop being a net beneficiary into equalization and the transfers as well. So it's a unique opportunity, I think, that hasn't existed at least in 30, 40 years in Canada.
All right, I don't see anyone else's hand up, so it means I get to ask another question. One of the things that people bring up to me often is about electricity versus oil and gas. And apparently, electricity is not calculated in, but oil and gas is calculated in. Is that true?
Yes, it is. So Crown Corporation revenue is not. So Hydro-Quebec is a Crown Corporation, just like Hydro Manitoba, Hydro One in Ontario. Crown Corporation revenues are not included, which allows a province to kind of play a shell game here with their revenues, because they are counted net against the revenues of the province on their fiscal statements that they produce that are audited by their auditor generals. So yes, royalty revenue is included in the calculation. Really, just like the Premier has said and others like Ted Morton have said, pick a lane. Either all royalty revenue is in and all Crown Corporation revenue is in, or all of it is out. You kind of have to pick both. My preference would be obviously to include all Crown Corporation revenues, because there's a fair way of doing it. If a province decides that it wants to get in the business of business, and I consider utilities a business just like any other, then their revenues should be counted against their total kind of transfers in and out, and it can't be considered have-not province if they have crown corporations which are generating huge revenues, which is the case in the province of Quebec. The province of Quebec is a huge producer of hydroelectricity. It exports a lot of that electricity as well. It has an international reputation for its engineers that build these hydro dams. So honestly and equitably, they should be included in the total revenues generated by province.
All right, folks, if you want to ask a question, just please raise your hand there. I got one more from Facebook here. Will there ever be a time when the seats are divided equally by province rather than per population, i.e. 40 seats per province?
Well, if you put 40 seats for Prince Edward Island, I think you'll have more politicians than you have people with common sense. The seats are assigned proportionally based on population. And so like the best example I can give you, Alberta has about 4.3 million people and 34 seats. The 4 Atlantic provinces have 2.5 million people and 32 seats. The problem isn't with, say, Quebec, which has 78 seats for just over 8 million people, because that's about proportional to what it should have. The problem is Atlantic Canada, which for a prolonged period of time has had a net out of Canadians moving to other parts of the country. And with 2.5 million people, they still have 32 seats. What you need to do is to increase the number of seats. And Prime Minister Harper actually changed the average for the assignment of seats and gave Alberta an extra 6 seats that we gained in that. You have about 1 million people in Manitoba, about 1 million people in Saskatchewan. Both of them have 14 seats. They're actually overrepresented technically if you look at the seat count based on average population, but their population is going up slowly still. And in Greater Toronto area, I think I calculated close to I think it was 76 seats. I have a chart in my Ottawa office where I keep it. If you did say 40 per province, it would be grossly unfair to very big provinces like Ontario, like Quebec. What we should aspire to is to make Alberta the most attractive place to come, work, and raise a family. I always tell, that's why I moved to Alberta, because I came here to work. I didn't come here to be on a welfare check. I didn't come here to, go sunbathing. I came here to work, which feels like a long time ago now, about 16 years ago, I think. I came here to do work and to raise a family and have all those opportunities. What we should aspire to is to make it possible again, and to attract as many other Canadians who feel like we do, think like we do, work like we do, and to raise our population up to the level of Quebec, so then we can also have 78 seats and have a bigger say in Confederation. Because if you include the population of British Columbia, include the population of Quebec, British Columbia, Alberta, we have about the same population as Quebec, and already we have about the same amount of seats as Quebec does. So it's already even proportionally across the country. Assigning a fixed number per province would make absolutely no sense. Then the Atlantic provinces would have 160 seats in our confederation. We'll be able to outvote, would have the same weight as the entirety of the Western provinces. That would make absolutely no sense. So that would be my take on it.
Mm-hmm. So on average, like, what is the average per member population? I know, like, my riding, the riding of Peace River Westlock, there I represent, I think it's 110,000 people.
So it's about that. It's about I think it's 103 to 105,000 is supposed to be the average, and there's allowed like a 5% variance. So for those who don't know, maybe in your area, I represent the second largest riding in Canada by population size. You have the square kilometers, I have the population. I have more people in my riding than the entire island of Prince Edward Island, which is a province with 4 members of parliament. And if you just think about how much work I have to do, so those 4 members of parliament have about 30 to 40,000 people. I have over 175,000 people in my riding. And the volume of emails and phone calls and follow-up is huge in comparison to what one MP in Prince Edward Island would have to do in comparison. So you really have those huge differences all across the country. The largest riding in Canada is actually in Alberta. It's Edmonton-Wetaskiwin. Our colleague Mike Lake has the biggest population. It's still booming because there's a huge suburb being built out there. I have many suburbs still being built here in Calgary despite the downturn. And that difference is also changed. So every 10 years, there's a census done. The next census is, I think, coming in 2023. That will again form the basis for another redistribution. We redistribute our seats every 10 years in Canada, and I'm confident that Alberta will get more seats again. I just don't know how many. But what we shouldn't aspire to is to fix the number of seats per province, because then again, Atlantic Canada would have a bigger say than it should by population size. We should aspire to trying to attract as many people to Alberta who want to work and raise a family just like we do, and grow our population to a size that makes us, a counterweight to, say, a province like Quebec or even Ontario or Toronto, for example.
All right. So the bill number is
C-263.
And you
rolls
got
off the tongue.
263. All right. And what's the title of it again?
It's it's called the Equalization and Transfers Fairness Act, and it amends a very complicated, much longer act, Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act.
All right. And do you have a petition site that we can sign on a petition for or anything like that yet?
Not yet, but if you want to sign up for updates on the bill, you can go to Tom Kmiec MP.ca, and there's a PMB button that you just click on. It'll take you to a page that has a further explanation of what I'm trying to do, the logic of it, the reasoning for it. And if you sign up there, I'm going to be sending out updates as often as I possibly can. I have another town hall I'm doing like this with one of our colleagues in Edmonton and with, I think, the executive director of Fairness Alberta, who I've been talking to on a regular basis about this private members bill. And then hopefully I can keep people updated on, my negotiations with the other parties, individual MPs. I'm sending a letter to every finance critic of the other official parties in Parliament to just lay out my position, finding common ground. Like this is supposed to be the meat and potatoes of legislating when you're a backbencher like I am, is to find that common ground with other opposition parties. We have an opportunity. We can outvote the government. So perhaps we can do it this time on equalization.
Sweet. Well, if there's any more questions, just please raise your hand. I'm not seeing anyone else raising their hand there, and we're getting to the top of the hour here shortly. So, Tom, I really do appreciate you coming out tonight. I know that equalization is a thing that we talk a lot about, but few of us have the understanding that you do about it. It's something that we're typically frustrated with. I know that Ottawa seems to take a lot of money and not a lot seems to come back. And then when they kick us in the teeth around pipelines and things like that, that's really frustrating. I should let you just talk a little bit about, we still got a few minutes here left. I remember you were the one that discovered that we had a infrastructure bank in Asia, and you made an interesting discovery there. I want to tell everybody about that.
So years ago, when I was on the finance committee, I do that control find, like I told you, and I found in one of these omnibus budget bills that Canada was going to purchase less than 1% share in something called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Usually these things would, people just get eyes kind of glaze over and you move on. And I was very interested. I'm like, I've never heard of this. I've heard of the ADB, which is the Asian Development Bank, Japanese run. It's based in the Philippines. Lots of Western countries participate. Big infrastructure projects get built. I thought, maybe this is something like that or has a new name. So I went online, I Googled it, and I found out, one, it's based in Beijing. Its president is a member of the CCP, the Communist Party of China. And as I was looking through all the projects that they were financing, I saw pipeline projects. So then I did a control find through the documents, and I thought, wait a minute here. So we have trouble building pipelines in Canada, but we as taxpayers are now going to purchase shares in a bank controlled by Beijing that is going to finance 3 pipelines overseas. It was paying for a pipeline project outside in the suburbs of Beijing. It paid for one in Bangladesh, and it was one of the banks that was financing the Trans-Anatolian pipeline out of Azerbaijan through Turkey to provide energy products to Europe and the world. So not only were the Liberals making it difficult for us to build pipelines in Canada and get them, to an export market, but they're also financing our competition and pipelines overseas indirectly by participating in this bank. So I just lost it at that committee. I filibustered it for hours. And then we moved to some amendments to try and reduce the number of money to $1 at the committee. That failed. We forced votes in Parliament. I tried to bring as much attention to this publicly as we could. And in the last election, we ran on a platform that Canada, under a majority Conservative government, would pull out of the Asian Infrastructure Bank. And now we see with everything that's happened since then, we should have done it then instead of, basically furthering the foreign policy interests of the government in Beijing. We made a huge mistake. The government of Canada made a huge mistake by investing, I'm going to do the scare quotes, investing in this bank, because we're paying for pipelines overseas while we can't get pipelines built at home.
Very good. And no one else sticking up their hands, so they must all be with rapt attention listening to what you have to say. So the last thing I'll let you go off on, and that's another project that you've been working on, not quite attached to equalization per se. It was why everyone showed up here, but interesting nonetheless. You recently did a video on these electric charging stations. What's the story on that one?
Yeah, so like if those of you who are sitting at home are wondering like why I care so much about equalization and numbers, I care about numbers. I love numbers, and what I tell my staff in my office is always, if you're ever curious why we waste so many billions of dollars, it starts with millions. So there is an EV subsidy program that started up in about 2018, 2019, but I went back to 2016 to capture all the data. So the government of Canada has spent $1.4 million in the province of Alberta to subsidize 13 out of 57 charging stations so far. 13 have been built, 57 is the target. And EV charging stations, like I'm not against electric vehicles, but I don't understand why the government of Canada has to get in the business of competing with the private sector. So I went to Strathmore, Aldersyde, just some communities around Calgary, where they're supposed to build these government subsidized EV charging stations. And then the next thing I asked my staff when we looked around, where is the closest private sector EV charging station? And wouldn't you know it, they were like within a minute. They were less than a kilometer away. So the government was using our tax dollars to subsidize an EV charging station when the private sector had already built one right nearby. And it was floored by it. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, $1.4 million when you're blowing $400 billion this year, 100 billion of which is not pandemic related spending, may not seem a lot, but those billions start at millions. And it's programs like these that maybe sound good in a tower somewhere in Ottawa when you're sitting around a conference room table having a taxpayer paid for lunch, maybe seems like a good idea, but maybe you should take a drive to Aldersyde with me, or come to Strathmore with me and go to the Canadian Tire where you're going to build this EV charging station. Explain to me why, because I don't understand it. And we even drove to Balzac, to Cross Iron Mills Mall, and same thing. The private sector had already built these charging stations, and now the government was competing for it. It just doesn't make sense. And I'm always, filing access to information requests. I'm submitting written questions to try and get numbers out and try to show to people like, this is where your money is going. You need to know, you need to pay attention, because if government is supposed to work for us, then it has to begin with residents and citizens informing themselves about how the government spends our money. There's the Public Accounts of Canada, which is the audited financial statements, but there are hundreds upon hundreds of pages. You don't have time to go through them. You have busy, normal lives to live. That's why you send people like you and I, Arnold, to go and read through like volumes of these very boring documents to then pick out information like this to say, here's an example of government waste that shouldn't happen. We can't leave it only to the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. That's what the core of our job is: government accountability, making them accountable, making them more transparent. So that's why I do videos like that.
Super. Well, thank you very much, Tom. We had folks from Donnelly, McLennan, Slave Lake, and Bard and Westlock, Peace River. Bill, I'm not sure where you are from. Peace River. But so hundreds of kilometers apart, and yet we all get to participate tonight with Tom from Calgary. So that's a big province that we represent here. And but such a pleasure to have you on tonight, Tom, and thank everyone else for joining us as well. Equalization continues to be a hot topic, and I hope that we got to shed some light on a few other interesting tidbits as well. So once again, I thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Dale and Emilio from my office for helping us backstop the whole meeting and getting it all organized beforehand. These Zoom meetings don't happen all by themselves, and so thanks to those guys as well. And look forward to seeing many of you at your council meetings or things like that. You're probably doing your council meetings by Zoom as well, so send me an invite. I'd love to come. Say hi to you folks wherever you are in northern Alberta. So with that, thanks so much again, Tom, and we'll see. I don't know, you're going to be in Ottawa this week?
Yes, I am in Ottawa for the next 2 weeks.
Okay.
Because I chair the Conservative meetings, and it's always easier to chair if I'm in Ottawa, trying to coordinate the technology to make it all work over Zoom. So yeah, I'm going to be there for the next 2 weeks.
Okay, I'm in Ottawa for the coming weeks as well.